their marriage. And he actually had already gotten completely sober. He found a medication which cured his stomach problem. And I have him, talking about that in an interview in the film. And then I show the evidence that he did a blood test in Rome because he had gone into a coma when he was really like didn't want to see Courtney Love, but he wanted to see his daughter, and so she took Frances Bean Cobain over to see him when he was in Rome, touring in Rome. She had been in England, playing music in England, but she got a sleep medication in England where it's legal to prescribe Rohypnol for sleep, and Rohypnol is roofies. And so she gets over there, and all of a sudden he's passed out in a coma. She waits a while to call an ambulance. She calls an ambulance, and she's puts on full makeup by the time they come there. And when they tested him at the Rome hospital, his blood had no illegal substances in it except for Rohypnol. So he wasn't a heroin addict at that time. A month before he died, he had no heroin in the system. That means he couldn't have been a heroin addict, at that time. And he wasn't even smoking weed. He wasn't doing any illicit substances at that time. And so a month later, they say, he died of, he killed himself. But best evidence is, and so I show Cyril Wecht, the former head of the American Academy of Forensic Science, saying that when a Pittsburgh news station saying that he believes that Kurt Cobain was murdered and was made to look like a suicide, based on all the evidence that he saw. And so he also says, one for Soaked in Bleach, and he said, I have that in my film, that he's in, his entire career, he's about 81, 82 years old, in his entire career, he's never seen anybody shoot up a massive amount of heroin, really enough to kill 6 people, he says, in an earlier interview that happened in the film, and then proceed to shoot himself. That he says it just doesn't make sense. And so that's some of the evidence that he was murdered and didn't commit suicide. But of course, I also have the interview of Eldon Hoke, who said that Courtney Love offered him $50,000 to blow her old man's head off. And he says in the film, he says, I end up not getting that money, but I know who did accept that money. And he started to say the name, but then he said, well, I better not say anymore. I'll let the FBI catch him. And then he dies several days after that interview on film for Nick Broomfield's Curt and Courtney. So that's some of the evidence that Courtney Love aided in powerful forces that killed Kurt Cobain. Now, then we have Hank Harrison's interview. And so you did a great job, Ed, when you were interviewing Hank Harrison, to take my evidence and my interview with Hank Harrison. I interviewed him for about 2 hours, and I just asked him about every little piece in his book that, including about Courtney Love, and the parts of Courtney Love that were most important to me were, he incidentally, befriended a CIA agent, a guy named Stephen O'Leary, who was traveling with his, he was living in Ireland when he was there doing research. And then Stephen O'Leary immediately clings to his daughter, Courtney Love, who was 16 and just turned 17 when she arrived in Dublin, Ireland. And so I show a quote of his that she was actually hooking on the street at the time, prostituting herself on the streets of Dublin at that time, because she was already a heroin addict and prostituted for the Taiwanese mafia and the Japanese mafia from the ages of 14 to about 16 or 17 around that time, or 18 or so. But here she was, just turned for Stephen O'Leary, and his brother Kevin O'Leary, who Harrison also told me about, and where he died in Minnesota area, and I got that in there and all that. So I should show a copy of the obituary. And so with that verified, O'Leary's taking Courtney Love over to London and traveling with her for 6 weeks, and she proceeds to hand acid and other drugs out like candy. And she does the same thing in Portland, she does the same thing in Los Angeles, and she does the same thing in Seattle. And that was her MO. So she was an asset. I showed this is just some of the evidence that she was an asset of the entire U.S. intelligence. It's the same what I'm in.